everybody. Welcome to another edition of Barbara's Banter. My co host Brian Boyer and I are delighted to have you today. And we are so pleased to have as our special guest today Maria Johnson Cicala, who I will introduce more formally in just a couple of minutes. While many are celebrating Black History Month by highlighting the awesome achievements of so many in the Black community, and rightfully so, we at Lang Strategies on Barbara's Banter wanted to explore issues of race, and particularly race equity in the workplace. How we got here, and what do we do to ensure that race equity is prominent in most businesses? We began this exploration last week with Dr. David Rennick, the senior pastor of National Presbyterian Church, who discussed the historical perspective on race issues and really a lot of discussion in Europe. How we got here with all this vitriol, and how, if possible, can we ever reconcile and heal? So today on part two, we will explore race equity in the workplace. Are we making any progress at all? Or are we taking 3 steps forward and 4 steps backwards? And what else needs to be done? Our guest today, Maria Johnson Cicala, is the perfect person to have that discussion, as she's not only talked about it, as so many people, she's actually done it. I met Maria probably 20 years or so ago when we both entered Fannie Mae on the very same day as officers of Fannie Mae. She was hired to develop and implement Fannie's diversity and inclusion program, which also included the corporate justice system that had not existed before. Her new initiative was directly tied to the office of the chairman, which gave it respect, it gave it accountability, and it gave it the authority for this initiative to be successful. Now, Maria is a lawyer, having gotten her law degree from Georgetown University after completing her undergraduate studies at Howard University. She was also a chief administrative judge in DC under Mayor Kelly. She was the first African American woman to serve in the US Navy JAG Reserves and was also Senate confirmed as the vice chair of the US Merit Systems Protection Board. And in her spare time, she did a little work with Metropolitan Police Department. Maria is biracial, having an African American father and an Italian mother. So she's the perfect person to give us the benefit of her wisdom and experiences today. Maria, welcome. We are delighted to have you on Barbara's Banter.
Barbara, this is the highlight of my year so far. The last two. This is great. Yes, we actually started the same week.
Oh, was it? I thought we were
the same week.
Okay.
And it was you, I, and LH. And we increased the diversity of the officer corps 300% because there was one Black officer and then the three of us. And then right. And we had a lot of fun together. We held each other's hand, we helped each other. But one, listening to the Reverend was his remarks are just so timely. It just incredible.
I told you I was so impressed when I watched his series. I watched it live last year because we still are not going into church, so everything is online. Mm-hmm. And so I was so impressed, and I've been telling Brian about this for several months. I said, we need to have him on. We need to have him on. And Brian suggested the ideal time would be Black History Month. So that's how he got here, and that's how you are here today.
Yeah, and let me correct one more thing for the record. The Navy actually did not give me a certificate that I was the first Black woman attorney. Oh, okay. And that's what they told me, it was a very pivotal time in my life.
Right.
But yes, so that's what I was told, and I haven't met anybody who said, no, I was there before you were. But it's interesting. one of the things that I look at and have used as kind of my guidepost, even at Fannie Mae, was I looked at how Department of Defense has handled, quote, the issue of diversity.
Mhm.
And I think it's interesting that this month, in this month, our Black Secretary of Defense, Austin, did the stand down, the military stand down.
Mhm.
And effectively, a lot of people don't understand what that means. But what he's doing is really quite brilliant in that, and civilian authorities should understand the correlation. What he's doing is what Jim Johnson and Larry Small did at Fannie Mae
Mhm.
longer than we need to go back, okay?
Right.
And they put the responsibility for achieving diversity directly into the laps of the executives in the chain of command in the
Mhm.
company,
Mhm.
okay? And until until companies are willing to totally link the as part of performance and compensation, those
That-
responsibilities,
That's when you get
compensation,
paid.
that'll get it every time.
Well,
And
right.
that is, and what he's doing, what the Secretary Austin is doing is that stand down, and they're allowing 30 days to put their things together. He's holding every flag officer in the military responsible for pushing this anti-extremist message and consequences if you don't follow it down into the organization, and it will be a roll down effect just at every command level.
Mhm.
It's real interesting because it's like it's worse than sending your kid for a timeout. This is some serious stuff that's going to impact promotion, retention,
Mhm.
a whole ramification of things. And I just think in 2021, it's interesting that the lead is again being taken by Defense Department.
Mhm.
1948, July of 1948, Truman, Executive Order 9980 and 9981, which desegregated the federal government, civilian workforce, and the military. It's a continuum of that.
Mhm.
And in every instance, I just find the correlation. It is really about war.
Well, that's interesting because I obviously don't have the military background, so I had not looked at it quite that same way. So it's interesting to have your perspective. If you look at where we are today, on race equity in the workplace, whether that's in the military you've just described, but I'm focused more on the corporate side, obviously. How do you compare where we are today versus where we were several years ago when you and I entered Fannie Mae together? Have we made any progress at
I
all?
don't agree with your 3 steps forward, 4 back. Okay,
All right,
that's a
so
little.
I said, I asked, were
I
we?
know that's a little extreme.
Okay.
Again, I'll go back to the military because corporate America thinks that they're so much better than military or government.
Mhm.
And having been, served in all of the branches, I don't see it. The only difference is they make more money in corporate.
Mhm.
But as far as processes and procedures, I don't think they have a heads up on any government organization.
Is that because of the discipline that the military?
I think it's partly discipline. I mean, the whole thing of World War II was it was not cost effective to
Mhm.
run 2 armies.
Mhm.
It just didn't work. And and remember, we were heading into Korea, and we already knew in 48 that Russia was on the horizon,
Mhm.
and so if some of the same lessons were translated to civilian, which in fact is the basis I used in setting up the Fannie Mae program. Like you mentioned, the corporate justice system. The corporate justice system I put together as a combination of best practices union workplace, which you're familiar, the corporate work environment with IBM, where you were, was a leader in employee resolution issues, and you came to Fannie Mae, I think, directly from IBM. And then your military judge advocate, UCMJ, how the military disciplinary system worked. So I took the best of the labor unions. I tried to eliminate the worst things, and I put into a speedy resolution. And so Jews is ombudsman. And employees, there's a lot going on in any organization. You know that, I know that. You were one of the popular officers that up and coming minority and women like to, bend your ear. I remember that. And if you don't have a place that you can go, a safe place, I think is the terminology that's frequently used today, where you can talk to somebody and know that it's confidential. We pre-whistleblower, even, where can I actually, because if organizations were to listen, to actually empathetically listen to what people at the lower levels are saying, a lot of things in organizations would change.
Right, because they're actually doing the work, and they're
doing,
there
they're on the grounds. As the military say, boots on the ground people. The employees can come up with better processes if people would listen to them. Managers, it's a leadership issue. Let's just get down to it. You cannot slice it or dice it any other way. And I think that to put the burden on people of color to fix the problem. And I think that the Reverend, and he hit the nail on the head. We're part of the solution, but we are not the whole solution.
Right, right.
So
in fact, that's one of my questions I have for you later on, because so many people look to people of color that we own this problem, when essentially we do not. Brian, you wanted to jump in. I see you jumping.
I did, but it's not the planned question. But this is actually really a question for both of you, because it really is a good point when you talk about credibility and leadership, right? To have, somebody who's white in a position to establish diversity and inclusion. And I guess my question, Maria, you're talking about different organizations. You're talking about military, which is different, obviously, than corporate. And then there are small, medium, large businesses. But I guess my question to both of you would be, and I think you kind of just said it, but is there any more credibility or less credibility that a white person has implementing this, or versus a person of color? Does it? Because it's obviously it's not just an issue for the person of color. It's an issue for everyone. But when it comes down to it, and as the leader of an organization, there are people looking to you to establish it, or looking to that leader to establish it. Is there any difference whether that person is white or that person is of color, of what kind of impact it will have on the organization?
This is being recorded, right?
Yes.
My opinion has evolved, okay, as all of us should grow as we learn more, right? When Barbara and I started, and we might as well just throw the year out there, Barbara, 1992, the early 90s.
Really old.
No, we were really young.
That's not that long ago, okay?
It really wasn't that long ago. It tended, the most diversity officers were either Black women or Black men. Okay. And a lot of us were lawyers, because so much of this stemmed from the different EEO laws, the different civil rights laws, the different housing law. I mean, just the basis was laws that were implemented throughout the course of our history, particularly in the 20th and 21st century. Some of the best diversity trainers I have met are white. Okay. And I think the concept is called allyship. It's a terminology that's gaining favor in the diversity world, where it's just, I think it kind of speaks for itself. Putting yourself in the position of being an ally. And allyship, really, and you're going to see more and more of that being used in training routines, is really focused at white employers, white managers, white leaders, into helping them to understand empathy and being in the other person's shoes. You'll be seeing a lot more of that. So I can't say that a person of color is necessarily going to do any better at a diversity initiative. And then, of course, it depends on the kind of organization you're dealing with. Is it a blue collar working environment? Is it a small business? You were the head of the chamber for many, many years. Over 50% of employment is through small businesses. Small businesses aren't doing diversity training. They don't have the money or even think they need it.
Right.
Okay, so it's just so many elements. So no, I don't think if you have to have a person of color to have a successful diversity initiative, there's only two things you really need. An absolute obsessive commitment from the top of the pyramid,
right,
and money.
Right.
And everything revolves around money, including the lack of equal opportunity. Because so much of what, and particularly in this 2021 environment, it boils down to plain old economics. What we're seeing around us today is a continuum of poverty, ignorance, lack of education opportunities, and limited resources. Okay. And then when you combine, forget about all the complexities of the pandemic and what that's doing, when you combine the fact that the education system in our country is horrible, particularly for people of colors. But then it's also horrible for poor whites at the bottom of the spectrum,
of the economic spectrum.
Right. Yeah. So classism in education is a big part of the problem. So people are looking at it, well, this is a color thing, or this is, a gender thing, or this is a sexual orientation thing. It's all of the above.
Well, and Dr. Remick said the other day, when he specifically talked about his experience in Scotland, since he is from Scotland and as a part of the UK, that a lot of the division there, the bulk of the division was not just about skin color, it was about class and what side of the tracks you lived on, where your housing and how you dressed. And all of that played into this class. I'm better than you because of my education, or I've got a little money, or I live in a better house than you. And therefore, if you don't have the things that I have, you're not as good as I am. And that was part of his discussion last week with us.
Yeah, and the mob mentality too, which if people start believing that,
right,
if one person starts to believe that, and then it starts to snowball, and people may have when it comes to background, Barbara, right? We talked about this a little bit. Maria, be interested in your perspective. When people start to feel a certain way, and then they start hearing leaders talk about it, and then they start hearing it on television
over and over and over again.
Exactly, almost to the point of propaganda, right? Oh, yeah. But then they start to follow it, and it doesn't matter whether it's accurate. It doesn't matter what the historical perspective is of it. They're not Googling it to find out if they're right or not. They're just following the mob mentality.
But that's from caveman days.
Right.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're still animals, and some more so than others. One of the most successful diversity training initiatives that I designed and was based on history, not just American history, but history of the world. And a lot of the things the Reverend referenced coming from Scotland, and and the history. If you go and look at the history, and I'm a huge history buff, poverty and poverty and lack of education has consistently been the driver on how people are treated differently. One of the popular diversity books in the 90s was when the Irish were called Black, which goes to what the Reverend was talking about, his Scottish, where they were the bottom of the heap, and different immigration of different groups at different times in history. People always feel they need somebody under them.
Right.
I mean, that's it, and I guess it goes back to the caveman days. I mean, if you think about looking back at history, it is totally irrational. If you look at the Civil War and slavery, that poor white, uneducated sharecroppers, or I mean, I don't even know if they were able to be sharecroppers then, because slavery was so much the rule in agriculture down there. Why they thought that their interests were more aligned with the slaveholder plantation owners to those the whites at the bottom who couldn't even feed their own families. There's a real disconnect there. That their interests were actually more aligned in equities with the slaves than they were with the slave master. It's what we're seeing today is that same mentality of this need to have somebody, quote, in their minds lesser than they are. And until there's economic parity at all the different levels, we're going to continue to see this.
You know, how do you, as we think about this a bit, and people that are viewing this podcast are looking at what they can do within their own businesses, their own organization. What steps for a company that is just starting to look at race equity in the workplace? What do you suggest the things that they start to do to put a D&I program in place?
Okay, when you say a company just starting, are you talking about a
Just
small
starting.
business?
Well, you know, small businesses, as we talked earlier, are likely not going to do much of this just because affordability, the commitment, and all of that. But your mid-size and larger businesses that are really starting to view this with a different lens. I mean, one of the things I said last week was when the knee on the neck of George Floyd last year, and there were so many other instances about the justice system as well. It wasn't, we now have, everybody's got a phone. Everybody's got a phone and it's got a camera. And so white America is now being made aware because it's right in everybody's face of what's going on. I think many knew it before, but they were suppressing their feelings. Now they can't deny it on what has gone on. So there are companies now that are looking at, maybe we ought to do something differently. Maybe our African American or Latino employees are feeling suppressed. So if they're starting to think about a diversity and inclusion program in their companies, what should they be think? How should they think about this?
I think that a lot of organizations overthink diversity initiatives. They make them more complicated than they need to be, because there's really only a handful of things you need to start, and it doesn't have to be expensive. Number one, if the top man or woman, hopefully it's a woman, sees that there's an economic correlation, and by economic correlation, sometimes it's hard to prove that if you hire the percentage of your workforce is this, that you're going to increase your output of widgets by this. That's a hard, complicated process to justify. I think at this point in our history, we should not have to justify it. If nothing else, just basic census demographics indicates that this is where the workforce is going. This is what your labor and talent pool is going to be. And if you want to continue to thrive and survive as a company, then you're going to need to be able to draw from a talent pool, a broad-based talent pool.
And that also means, though, recruiting differently.
Barbara, we've been together too long. We've been together too long. It's how recruiting is done. If you're really committed, there's a whole variety of techniques that are being experimented with or successfully used.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from resumes, where you remove the names and schools that people go to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that many a Howard University graduate resume, it has been put aside just because it says Howard University,
Mm-hmm.
Or other historically Black colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm.
I know that for a fact.
Right.
So what if you remove the names of schools?
Mm-hmm.
Where the HR person just certifies that they have a degree from an accredited college and they have their law degree from an accredited college, those kind of identifying factors.
Mm-hmm.
How the recruiting is done, where are you advertising?
Right.
With the police department, it was a competition, a nationwide competition for police officers, and only about 10 do most of the recruiting, the big city police departments. Mm-hmm. But they hadn't updated their market, how they were targeting their market. Where were they putting their advertising dollars? So there's a lot of in-house things that can be done on the HR recruiting side. What schools you pick to go and send recruiters out to. Obviously, the pandemic has affected that.
Sure.
If you remember Fannie Mae, we had a very successful intern program with high schools. Mm-hmm. Our philosophy was to start growing our own, mm-hmm. i.e. starting
scholars program. Wasn't the Johnson
the Woodson, we had the Woodson program, the Woodson program.
That's right.
I mean, right in DC right now, the new police chief Conte, he was part of an intern program in a high school with the DC Police Department. Mm-hmm. And they were and are growing their own. Companies can do that without a lot of it's nice when you have a full-blown diversity department with all these different things and all, it's great, but it's not essential to spend millions of dollars to get the ball rolling. Mm-hmm. So while you need the leadership, it's essential for the leadership at the top. People in the middle of the organization can make changes on their own without getting permission, mm-hmm. but they don't think about it. Mm-hmm. And like I'm a member of SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. Mm-hmm. There is just a wealth of ideas that for a $200 membership, you can Google in here and get ideas to get things jump-started in the mm-hmm. organization. It just takes a few people with some imagination that want to do things a different way. And it ain't complicated.
And a commitment to wanting
a commitment to do it because of a long-term vision.
Right.
Because of a long-term vision that if we want to continue to be successful, this is what we have to do, and we have to compete against resources. I think that what we've seen in this last 4 years should not have necessarily been a surprise to anybody. Mm-hmm. Because these isms are a continuum, and having been born in Italy and you met my mother.
I knew your mother, yes.
Yes, and as I appreciated so much as I was in high school and college, and in the later years when Mom lived with me, where she would talk about the rise of fascism in Italy. Mm-hmm. And what we observed, and it always amazed me that the media didn't cover this very much. And like you, I was a 24-hour news junkie, and I finally realized these last few years it was hurting my health. So I started limiting. I don't watch things in the evening because I don't sleep. I had to start controlling, like when you're dieting, you got to control your intake and be selective where you get your news. But these are all continuum. It gets back to education. Mm-hmm. In slavery, people didn't want slaves should be able to read. Because knowledge is power.
Absolutely, it is.
Brown versus the Board of Education, separate is not equal. It's education. We're in another crisis right now where kids are not able to go to school, and they know without any questions that remote learning is not working. We have a whole generation that is going to be 1 to 2 years behind.
Sure.
If they will, and in your lower socioeconomic brackets, regardless of race, they're never going to catch up.
Right.
So this continuum of the haves and the have-nots, but the wealth gap continues to grow.
Yeah.
There's no easy solutions, and until a perfect example. One of the most impactful things that happened politically in the last few years was the attempt to control the census. Okay, people don't look at it as big as it was. What's the fuss? Some people understood, but what the impact is, it affects us for the next 10 years.
Right.
Because it affects the layout of the political jurisdictions. And that determines how much money the jurisdictions get from the federal government for everything. But more importantly, it affects the demographics of who your elected representatives are because of the gerrymandering. And how does the gerrymandering, the Republicans, and I'm a Republican, still a registered Republican, they have figured out that if you can control the political process at the state and local level, okay, and then who you send to Congress controls the power and the dollars. Right. Well, one reason I have not changed my registration as Republican, because Shirley Chisholm, and I was in the room with her at the Democratic Convention in Miami in 71 or 72. And she said that Black folks cannot put all our political eggs in one political basket, that we have to be immersed in both organizations, so that we are not, our vote is not taken for granted. If I was a registered Democrat, I would not be able to vote in a Republican primary. Okay, to even have a tiny, potentially hopeful impact on who the candidates are.
Right.
Okay, and so
way to look at
census, but so people think, oh, what's the big fuss of the census? Well, the census is and then once these people get into office, they may be there 20, 30, 40 years.
Oh yeah, they look at it as a career, not there for
but
a short period of time to make a difference,
Right. So as diversity initiatives, to me, it's important for people to be politically informed about the consequences of everything they do. So I see diversity as what's the impact of voter registration ID? Should we have it? Should we not? There's pros, there's cons. But if people of color, and that brings me another thought. When we started, Barbara, the diversity initiatives was pretty much people of color, African American, and women. Okay. I can tell you that there's probably this many categories of interests that are now under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure.
And so the focus, and all of them are good, worthy, worthwhile things to be very concerned about. But from the initial civil rights, the groups that are most impacted by everything from super fun waste sites and where housing is built, lower income housing, where that's built in the most toxic environments in the country have been set aside.
So while the expansion is good, it has certainly diluted, is that what you're saying, the focus on people of color?
Absolutely. And so that's why I don't think from the perspective of people of color, we're seeing as much progress because the resources have been spread out. And I'm not saying that that's not the right thing to do, but
it's a reality that
it's the reality because there's so many underserved communities who haven't been treated fairly for eons.
Right.
But
right.
again, again, it gets back to recruiting. It's two issues. One is your recruiting, but the recruiting, as you know, is tied in to retention and pay equity issues. So it's your recruiting, internal processes, which don't have to necessarily start at the top. They can flow up also. Pay equity issues, and also your recruiting, where you recruit, your internal processes. All of those things are part of. They don't have to be expensive. I have come to the conclusion that you could actually start in a mid-sized company a successful diversity initiative with a mentor program, an ombudsman program, because I believe that people are being trained, they're being overtrained. And when you sit down and your work is still piled up on your desk, and then you're told that you have to take additional training, and you can't make a direct correlation to, is this going to impact my paycheck? And more companies, for any number of reasons, are switching to online training, which we now know without a doubt ain't working too well for kids. Right. And we know that adults have an attention span of a gnat, right? Right. I mean, so why do we think that the diversity training online is the end all be all? But people use diversity training. Let me buy these prepackaged things. Let's have Black History Month and Hispanic History Month and Women History Month, and then they think they've done it.
Right, and I can attest that having the in-person training, and of course we're not doing any of that now,
right,
just because of the pandemic. But even prior to that, it's not the same by having the face-to-face interaction with people and the exercises that we used to do in any training, but certainly
any training, right?
In any training, but certainly diversity training. Brian, did you want to ask one more question before we get to the end here? I told you we go on and on.
I know this is a huge conversation, and again, you're listening to Barbara's Banter. And we're talking with Maria here about, it's a big conversation. This could go weeks, right? Months. This could be a
years,
a whole series. Yeah, I'll wrap it my part up. You talk about the commitment of organizations to diversity and inclusion, and then you talk about some of the means to which that can be achieved. What happens? I guess my question is, when there's a wrinkle in that organization, as far as maybe there was a diversity issue. Maybe there's some acrimony amongst the employee base. That's kind of an added variable. I would think it's one thing, and maybe, I don't know, maybe that's easier because you have an example to point towards to say we don't want to be like that. Or does that cause an extra obstacle, an extra layer of challenge for the leaders in that organization trying to incorporate and establish a diversity and inclusion program?
I think that conflict is part of everyday life. I mean, I remember being on the school ground of Catholic grade school, and there's going to always be the kids you don't get along with, the little fisticuffs, the nuns breaking you up. It's a continuum. You have conflicts in families, in a church organization. It's how you handle the conflict. And if justice has to be meted out in that kind of environment, is it done fairly and is it done promptly? That is really, that's important, that people feel that the forum is fair. and the other thing is, Black History Month, all the different history months have played an invaluable role in diversity, recognizing the need and the value. However, if you might recall, Barbara, and I'm leaning more and more this way, We started making diversity every day, where we were putting on the website, and I don't want to see Black history just out there every day in February. Why isn't it every day on a every corporate website, in this day in history, and interweave Black history accomplishments, Hispanic history accomplishments, Asian Pacific, weave them into the everyday fabric
of how you do business.
And recognize. So I'm not saying that you don't need the Black History Month, but why isn't it continued, woven into every day, recognizing the values of people who are different at every level? Right. That's a no cost thing to create a culture where you're used to seeing and learning things about people that are different than you.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Very good.
Take us home, Barbara.
Huh? So it's me to bring this home, since we have talked so much, and we've certainly not solved all the problems. I think my last question to you, Maria, and it is one that I asked Dr. Remick last week. In our first segment on race, in our discussion with him, we talked about how we got to this place in America, and I gave him some options, and it's whether the fear of the loss of power and control, whether it's the forecast of browning of America that will exist in sometime in the future, 30, 40, 50 years from now, whether it's both of those things, or was it having the first African-American president in the White House that made people stand up and say something's being taken away from us? And I just wonder, what do you think is causing what we have seen over the past few years?
Okay, all of the above, but if I had to pick the trigger for 2016 was the election of President Obama. Okay. And again, if you look at history, your Tea Party is a direct result of that. I don't know if we would have had Trumpism the way it is today if Barack Obama had not been elected. Now, I'm very happy he was, and I think he did a darn good job. And I think what he could have accomplished if he hadn't been constantly, deliberately attempted to be undermined. And he still accomplished some incredible things.
Right.
So absolutely, back to history. And I don't like to just make this a political about the recent administration, but you can't overlook it. One of the former president's top advisors was Roy Cohn. Okay, you know where I'm going with this. From the age of 27. And Roy Cohn was brought into his world because the Trump organization was being sued, and I believe they were the first housing discrimination case brought by the federal government.
Right.
Now, and Brian knows, but a lot of people may not realize, Roy Cohn was the advisor and lawyer for Joe McCarthy, which was probably the previous hate-inspired in the 50s. These things come in historic waves. Right. And the Roy Cohn piece, it's had the Central Park Five. This hate environment started before birthism and all that. This was a long time coming. And the thing that I'm disappointed I rarely would see is that the rise for that 2016 to 2020 era was identical to the fascist, the between World War I and World War II. And again, that boiled down to economics. Again, you can't get away from the economics. It's about control of wealth and resources, and until there are more equities, what do I say? It's frustrating. Sometimes I wonder why I picked this profession, but then I have a passion for it. And yes, we are making progress.
Okay, that's the end of that. That's the end of that, right? We are making some progress.
But it's sometimes you wonder.
Well, you get a little disillusioned, as
Yeah.
I said last week, on just the hate and the vitriol.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just so disturbing. And there's some days you just want to stay in bed with the covers over your head and not peek out at all, because it has been so bad. And one of the things I said last week to Dr. Remick was that I grew up as a child of the 60s, and I was, part of the whole civil rights era. And I did my fair share of marching, though I never got arrested though. And I have never felt more scared as I did last year. And I did not feel that same, I did not have that same fear years ago when I was a kid growing up in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm from the South. So something was different this past year that certainly instilled more fear in people like me and like you that I had not experienced before. So the challenging times. And as I said the other day, I said, though sometimes you want to give up and you're disappointed and disillusioned, but giving up is certainly not an option.
And progress has been made. I also think that because of the 24/7 cycle, the Twitter, the constant misinformation, accurate information, that some of the things we're seeing are amplified because it's just over and over and over and over. It's nonstop. It is absolutely nonstop. Sometimes I wonder, and you remember the George Wallace campaign. I really wonder if we're at any different place today than if George Wallace had got elected.
Well, and that was my point of how, sometimes I'm not sure that we're any better off. And certainly the fear factor for last year, the last 2 or 3 years, is greater with me than it was when I was a kid growing up and the big white man sat on me on the stoop.
I remember
going home. So it's because I would not get up and give him my seat. So, you just relate those things, and you said, my goodness, and that makes me ask whether we've made progress, but I think we have. So,
but remember this, Barbara, and you know, my Italian roots and your family's connected to Italy also. I would go to Italy 25 years ago, and you were seeing the same thing starting as African migrants were leaving Africa for famine and war and all these things, and going to Italy, and you were seeing that same groundswell. And again, it was the basis was, I believe, in large part economic.
Right.
And competing for resources, and it's a worldwide problem.
Again, it's all about the money. So I think that's all we have time for today. I'm sure we've gone over Brian's time limit here, but
it's okay. It's about the value of the content, which was great. So that's what it's all about.
As I mentioned at the beginning of part 1 of the podcast, it's a complex issue. And there's so many tentacles that can spin off from the discussion and where we could lead us. And you see, Maria and Brian and I did that today. We certainly have not solved the racial problems in the US, but we hope that we have provided to you, our viewers, some different perspectives and things for you to consider. Maria, thank you so much for joining.
As usual, it's great seeing you again, Brian.
You as well. Let's do it again soon.
Very good. Very good.
Appreciate your time and expertise and perspective. And to our
viewers, we all have a passion. We all have a passion for this, and we've seen it evolve over
time. Yeah. To our viewers, thank you so much for joining us as well. And remember to join us for Lang Leader Class for more lessons in leadership, found on langstrategies.com. Until next time, have a good day. Goodbye, everybody.